It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. Beautiful introduction. I didn't know I had a pre-decor, but now I do. And that, what you said about the book using personal experience as a tuning fork, I think is really beautiful and resonates a lot with me. And I thought I would read, I'm going to say a few words about the collection as a whole and how it came together and some of the questions that guided my writing of it, but then I'm going to read from two different pieces that land in different spots in terms of how the self is encountering the world and how I'm sort of balancing describing my personal experience of an encounter with that act of looking outward and recording what I see. And so the collection didn't come about because I sat down one day or got up one day and decided to write a book about empathy. It wasn't as intentional and cohesive as that. I started writing essays that on the surface seemed to be about quite different things. I went to 125-mile ultra marathon in Tennessee. I took a bus tour through gang territories in LA. I went through my own health troubles and started writing about them. But as I investigated in these different directions, I started to feel that there were questions that were common to all of them. Things like, how do we try to imagine our way into the experience of other people? Things like, how do we make our pain legible to other people? Or how do we try to read the pain of others in structured ways as tourists, in structured ways as readers and writers, or in unstructured ways just as human beings caught in encounters. So I started to think about, what if I put all these pieces together, and some of them were quite personal and some of them were more critical, and in some of them I was working as a journalist, and let all of those different modes speak to each other, see what happened when they were all forced into the space of the same volume. And that's how the collection came into being. And as Ethan said, once I'm done reading, I would really love questions, anything about what I've read, about the collection, about being a writer, horribly embarrassing questions about my personal life, any of it. I would love to hear what you're thinking and wondering in response to all of this. So I thought to start, I'm going to read from an essay that I actually don't read from very much, and I realized that for whatever set of reasons I've been thinking about it a lot recently, and some of the issues that came up in it, and so it felt like time to go back into it and share it again. And it's a piece called Lost Boys. The first film begins with bicycles salvaged from a muddy creek. We're in the woods. Men stand to their shins in dirty water, moving awkwardly in button-down shirts, speaking in ragged Arkansan accents, saying, "Don't let nobody in here," like boys defending a fort, cordoned by yellow tape. Except they aren't boys. There are no boys, which is the point. The boys are dead. They say boys killed them. The police stand over 3 bodies so unbelievably pale and thin on the ground, hog-tied by their shoelaces, their ghost skin stuck with green leaves. They look like sleeping changelings. Changeling means a child stolen by spirits, or else the demon left in his place. 3 boys were killed in May in 1993. And in their place, 3 demons were found, delivered as sacrifice. The film's opening shots crackle with the back and forth of police radio. The officers don't know what to do with these bodies. The film is gray and bleary. The visual quality seems plucked from that strange purgatory just after waking, when you are trying to remind yourself that whatever you dreamed, a death, a guilt, some wreckage, isn't real. That failed hope thickens this gray light. Gradually, music swells under the voices of the police. You can barely hear the men anymore, but you can see the darker lines of water on their pants where they have waded into the creek. 2 of the boys were drowned. 1 bled to death on the banks. The music is Metallica, the early chords of Welcome Home, Sanitarium. Its volume rises stubbornly, obscuring the sounds of the investigation. It sounds like a kid turning up the stereo in his bedroom to drown out the sound of his father's voice beyond the door. The case. Here's what happened. 3 boys were killed, 3 more were charged, and 3 films were made by 2 men who spent more than 15 years following the story. On May 6, 1993, Stephen Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore were found in a patch of woods behind a truck stop in an Arkansas town called West Memphis. 3 teenagers, Jesse Miskelly Jr., Jason Baldwin, and Damien Eccles, were brought into custody and charged on counts of capital murder. The murders were deemed satanic rituals, and Damien was called a Satanist. He and Jason were known for wearing black, loving heavy metal, and sketching wizards. Their hair was long. They hated where they came from. They were teenagers, basically, charged with a brutal crime on largely circumstantial evidence. 2 New York filmmakers, Joe Berliner and Bruce Sinofsky, decided to make a film, and then a sequel, and then a third, to show the world how this trio, soon known as the West Memphis 3, got to prison and stayed there. The trilogy, called Paradise Lost, follows the accused through their original trials, their appeals, and the years of their incarceration. The third film was already in post-production by the time something unexpected happened. The men filed something called an Alford plea on August 19, 2011, and were released. This was basically the state admitting it was wrong without admitting it was wrong. The release appears as an epilogue to the last film, and though it emerges from an exhaustive legal tangle the film makes comprehensible, it still feels like an unaccountable miracle, an ending that might have been called unbelievable had the films been anything but documentary. The place. You see a lot of highways in Paradise Lost. You see a lot of highways because West Memphis has a lot of highways. The town sits where 2 of the country's biggest interstates, I-55 and I-40, intersect at the Mississippi River. Real Memphis is just across the water. These days, average per capita income is just under $20,000 a year. The films seem fascinated by the arteries of the city. Its camera keeps swooping along the lines they carve, over concrete lots and beige mall roofs, trailer parks and junk trucks on dirt shoulders. Metallica provides the soundtrack for all these panoramic shots, lending music to the ugliness of it all, the sameness, the irony of being trapped poor in a land full of highways going everywhere else. These aerial views begin to tell the story underneath this story, which is a story about poverty. It's a story about double wides and disrepair and chain smoking and chain link fences and weeds growing through rusted truck cabs and neighborhoods built around the fact of highways and boys who hang out at convenience stores and break into trailers with their girlfriends and mothers with hair gone crunchy from gel and mothers with pill habits. This is a story about white trash families kneeling at the graves of their sons. This is a story about people who felt invisible before this tragedy brought them into view. It's a story about boys who can't afford their own suits or their own legal representation. They take whatever the state hands them, and they will continue doing this for years until a set of films makes it possible for them to do otherwise. Jesse's stepmom sums it up pretty nicely. If we had money, she says, do you think these 3 boys would have been picked on? The woods. The bodies were found in a patch of forest called Robin Hood Hills, a swath of lush green nestled beside a truck stop. It's right next to the highway, but large enough to get lost in. The fallen Eden of the overly developed world skirts the fallen Eden of these woods. Robin Hood Hills should summon a merry band of outlaws, but every time I hear it, I think of Peter Pan instead. My mind insists on the fairy tale that best applies. Peter Pan means Neverland, where boys never become men. Boys is a confusing word when you're trying to tell this story. 3 boys accused of killing 3 boys. 6 characters splitting custody of youth, but not of innocence. These are not boys that murdered our kids, one victim's father says. They stopped being boys when they planned this. The trailers for the film show a 3x2 grid of photos, school portraits of the dead boys forming the top row, mug shots of the accused underneath. The visual insistence on this geometric alignment, on the news, in the papers, stems from the same hunger for answers that eventually prompted the conviction. The compulsion to find a symmetric solution to all this mess. 3 victims, 3 killers. A 3x2 grid is comprehensible as a spreadsheet. People crave some web of correspondence, however evil, something captured and framed by right angles, made right, made orderly, in a still, 6 stills, finally kept still, finally ordered. The accused. Why did Jamison and Jason and Jesse get arrested? Jesse confessed is why, and implicated the other 2. Confession can be hard to see around, but Jesse's confession looks pretty frail in context. He's brought into the station on nothing and treated like a criminal. He's got an IQ of 72, which puts him at roughly the mental capacity of a 6-year-old. He's interrogated for 12 hours straight, and only the last 41 minutes are taped. He gets some important details wrong before he's guided into getting them right. He says the murders happened around noon when the boys were still in school, until he's corralled into admitting they actually happened at night. I know false confessions happen all the time. I'm horrified by them, of course, and by the fact that many can't admit, can't accept that they happen, and horrified by the justice system that lets them happen, that forces them to happen. And still, despite all this, it's hard to deny how convincing it is to hear a voice confessing to a crime. I feel compelled against myself listening to the recording as it's played during Jesse's trial. How could it be anything but the truth? Why would somebody speak words that they didn't mean? Western culture, says literary theorist Peter Brooks, has made confessional speech a prime mark of authenticity, par excellence, the kind of speech in which the individual authenticates his inner truth. An authenticated inner truth. 12 hours, a couple of cops trying to do their jobs. After his conviction, Jesse is offered a reduced sentence to repeat his confession at Damien and Jason's trial. He refuses. He could have years of his life back, and he says no. Jesse is tiny. At one point, his defense lawyers refer to him as Little Jesse. Little Jesse, not big enough to be a boy killer. He's dwarfed by the officers who escort him into court. He's dwarfed by his own suit. Michael Moore's father wonders why taxpayer money has funded suits for the accused. They're in jail, he says. They should wear jail clothes. This is the tempting tautology of accusation, guilty until proven innocent. Wear your jail clothes until we decide you deserve something else. Jesse wears clothes that don't fit. He looks like he's playing dress up. He looks like the little boy he's forfeited his right to be. He's got ruffled hair and he mumbles, and there's still some joy and mischief in his grin when it comes. In his cell, he keeps Hallmark cards from his family lined on a shelf. He reads their messages in a shaky, effortful voice, sounding out every syllable. He's partway between schoolboy and man. He's propped up a magazine picture of a chick in a bikini. When Jesse talks to his father on the phone from prison, their conversation is wrenchingly banal. How are you? All right. All right? Yeah, I'm all right. But it eventually gets around to the subject of a hurt hand. Jesse punched the metal toilet in his cell. He's worried a bone might be broken. His father says, if you can move it, it ain't broken. There is a deep care evident between them. At moments, Jesse Sr. still laughs. The camera gets close on his laughter. A father takes pleasure in his son over a telephone line, despite everything. In an interview, Jesse is asked what he does at night. I just cry a lot, he says, and then I go to sleep. At the time of his trial, Jason Baldwin looks too young for puberty, much less the death penalty. It's heartbreaking. His hair is light blonde like an aura around his head, something from 19th century spirit photos. When I watch him, I feel almost broken at his frailty, his teeth as skewed as his mother's, a gaunt woman whose voice seems to chew on itself. And it's in these moments of aching for Jason, at the climax of my sadness, that I catch myself wondering, what if they actually did it? I get a terrifying flash of them in the woods, doing the things they've been accused of, and I feel a pang of guilt as if I've betrayed them simply by doubting their innocence for a moment. But here's the thing, I have no idea. I can look at the evidence as mediated by a documentary and feel outraged. I can look at the court's eventual decision to overturn its first decision, practically speaking, and I can feel confirmed in that outrage. I can look at the faces of these boys and feel the strength of truth in what they say, but I can't ever know. No one can know, except for them and the person who did it, if that person is out there. So I feel my heart breaking toward a truth I can't be entirely sure of. It's an odd sort of vertigo, affective conviction thrust against epistemological uncertainty. Doing his first film interview in jail, Jason drinks a Mellow Yellow and eats a Snickers bar. This is somehow the saddest part of the scene, sadder even than the things he says. To think of how these treats are nothing in the face of everything, but still the only things he got to choose all day. Empathy is easier when it comes to concrete particulars. I can't imagine being in prison, but I can imagine choosing a snack. So I'm pulled close to the fact of Jason's candy bar, and, once close to this detail, feel suddenly overwhelmed by the split that renders it irrelevant. The essential divide between his incarceration and my freedom. Jason is free as well now, and I wonder what he eats. I wonder what he missed most. But on screen, still in jail, all he can do is drink a pea yellow soda. He says he couldn't kill an animal or a person. He talks about his iguana. It's his favorite of all his pets. I understand the detail of this iguana as an instance of editorial construction. How can you see a boy who looks 10 years old talking about his iguana and believe he's a murderer? I'm aware that the filmmakers are essentially deploying this moment, how it proclaims Jason's innocence more affectively than his own denial. But I'm also complicit in the vision they've offered me. I believe what Jason says about his iguana. I believe what he says about not killing those boys. His lawyer asks him, what does he want to do once the trial is over? Maybe go to Disneyland, he says. He's never been on a trip except to some mineral springs nearby. Sounds like Hero Springs in his mumbling, though he might have just said hot. I want to picture Jason Baldwin on a trip. I want to be inside his head when he hears not guilty, and I want to follow him on an airplane all the way to Anaheim. This is one of the delusions documentary invites. If it's all edited anyway, if it's all artifact, couldn't it take another turn? Couldn't there be another ending? And the essay goes on from there, but I'm gonna stop and read another shorter piece that's also interested in this question of how something that's made, a documentary or a book or a photograph, invites us to feel close to something, to somebody else's experience, to a moment in history, to a choice, but also how there's always that distance that remains. And also we're always bringing our own baggage to the encounter, our own lives, our own desires, our own prejudices. All of that is always there with us. And this piece is actually a Connecticut piece. I wrote it when I lived in New Haven, and it is partially about moving there, so it feels right to read here. It's called The Broken Heart of James Agee. Many nights that autumn I went to a bar where the floor was covered with peanut shells, and I drank, and I read James Agee. Liquor carried his vision of trauma all through me, twisted me pliable to the loss, and I wasn't afraid to think like this, pliable to the loss, because I was drunk, and drunk meant sentiment was not only permissible but imperative. It was boundless. Turns out Let Us Now Praise Famous Men wasn't about famous men. It was about bedbugs and mildewed bridal caps and farmhouses like cracked nipples on the land. It was about how Agee wanted to fuck one of the women he was writing about. Also, it was about guilt. Mainly it was about guilt. Originally, it was a magazine article gone rogue. In 1936, Fortune magazine told Agee to write a journalistic piece about sharecroppers in the Deep South, and he gave them a spiritual dark night of the soul instead. They rejected it. He wrote another 400 pages. It's a hard book to classify. It's got sections that don't seem to belong together, discussions of cotton prices and denim overalls and the soul as an angel nailed to a cross. It uses colons somewhat like this sentence does, rapidly. It's so long-winded and beautiful, you want to shake it by the bones of its gorgeous shoulders and make it stop. But the difficulty of closure is one of its obsessions, the endlessness of labor and hunger. It's trying to tell a story that won't end. I was trying at the time I read it to tell a story of my own. I'd recently returned to America after living in Nicaragua, where I'd been robbed and punched in the face one night, drunk. My nose had been broken, then partly fixed by an expensive surgeon in Los Angeles. I'd moved to New Haven, where it seemed like someone was always getting mugged. I was afraid to walk alone in the dark. Nearly all is cruelly stained, Agee wrote, in the tensions of physical need. There's a notion we absorb about suffering, that it should expand us, render us porous, but this didn't happen to me. I felt shrunk. Damage became fear. It became an insistence. I read Agee thinking about his own guilt when he was supposed to be thinking about 3 Alabama families, and I thought about myself when I was supposed to be thinking about Agee. Or else, I thought of everyone who wasn't me, back on the streets of Granada. I thought of the boys I'd tutored some afternoons, glue-addicted and homeless with their runny noses and loose pants, catching them as they prowled the cantinas of Calle Calzada looking for money and company. I thought of Luis, who'd fallen asleep on the steps of the home where I lived, and how I hadn't invited him inside at night, only woken him up, nudged his shoulder, because he was blocking the door. I inspected this memory for the shown seams of a moral. What should I have done? Maybe Agee kept writing because he was looking for the stitching of a moral too. Maybe that's why he couldn't stop. I loved getting sad about Agee because his sadness wasn't mine. My face was claustrophobic and Agee was something else. He was something I wasn't. Tragedy is secondhand. Faulkner wrote that, which meant, to me, families in Alabama hurt more than I ever would, and I could show up at a dingy bar and admit that. This wasn't enough, but it was something. Agee felt this about his own book. It wasn't enough, but it was something. He writes of a woman's daily work in the cotton fields. How is it possible to be made clear enough? The many processes of wearying effort which make the shape of each one of her living days. How is it to be calculated the number of times she has done these things, the number of times she is still to do them? How conceivably in words is it to be given as it is in actuality, the accumulated weight of these actions upon her, and what this accumulation has made of her body, and what it has made of her mind, and of her heart, and of her being? Empathy is contagion. A.G. catches it and passes it to us. He wants his words to stay in us as deepest and most iron anguish and guilt. They have stayed. They do stay. They catch as splinters still in the open, supplicating palms of this essay. If it were possible, A.G. claims, he wouldn't have used words at all. If I could do it, he wrote, I'd do no writing at all here. In this way, we are prepared for the 400 pages of writing that follow. A piece of the body torn out by the roots, he continues, might be more to the point. A.G. doesn't offer actuality. He only wonders what this actuality might look like, an adequate description, what this accumulation has made, and suspends that possibility in the margins of his book, everything he can't manage. On the question of poverty and its effect on consciousness, he is merciless. The brain is quietly drawn and quartered. His book does the same to its story, slicing it to pieces and putting it back together in fragments. The house, the dawn, the animals, the men, communism, children. He calls his work the effort to perceive simply the cruel radiance of what is. What is, it seems, was broken. So A.G. broke his book to fit. Subject holds structure in its thrall. Poverty pulls apart consciousness, dissolved into bodily necessity and stricture, and A.G. pulls apart narrative, drawn and quartered. He doesn't think he'll do his subjects justice. I feel sure in advance that any efforts in what follows along the lines I have been speaking of will be failures. He chokes on his words, interrupted by the commas and clauses of his own apologies. He stutters here. He stutters often. I found it hard to talk about getting hurt. I kept trying to make it something larger than itself, that single moment in the street, to make it part of a pattern. The easiest pattern was guilt. My hand had been on a sleeping boy's shoulder, shaking him awake. What does concrete make you dream? I dream of that boy in circles. I dream of where my hand was. I could think forever about the man who hit me, how little he had, most likely, and how big a difference it might have made to him to sell my little digital camera wherever he sold my little digital camera. That camera I would have given him easily, just to keep his hand from striking my face. A.G. went somewhere to look at poverty and tried to take the damage onto himself, to strip away its metaphors and get to some clean, torn truth beneath. The literal feeling, he wrote, by which the words a broken heart are no longer poetic, but are merely the most accurate possible description. What was broken in me that fall wasn't poetry. My face wasn't useful as metaphor or aperture. It was only the accurate description of where a hand had been. What good is guilt? A.G. asked. We ask. We like the sound of the question. It puts a crude finger on a heartbeat in us that won't stop racing, a pulse broken in sympathy. It makes us talk. It makes us talk about ourselves. It makes us confess. We want to purge something that even confession won't justify. That sleeping boy. A.G. drank when he wrote, and I drank when I read him. A.G. threw himself at the feet of his subjects, and I couldn't even bring myself to walk alone at night, with my bone-broken nose and my vodka-flung and fluttering heart. You get drunk and then you get sentimental, or else you get drunk and get hit. I told myself there was something dense and meaningful in my fear, an earned experience, the residue of contact, a cruel radiance. But truly there was nothing but my arms crossed over my chest as I walked on empty streets and no one coming after me in the dark. Thanks. And so questions about those pieces or the book more generally, or the life of not any writer, but this writer. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to know about the life of the writer, but before I do, I have a question.
Yeah.
What it's like to read those pieces when I happen to be sitting in the front, and when you speak regularly, your feet are planted
Yeah.
and spread out. But when you read the first piece, you only stood on one leg and you kept the other one twirling. And when you began the second piece, you had one leg standing like up in the air. And then it was back. So, and then as soon as you stopped, you went back to this posture.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely, sometimes I lean over when I read, like I get closer to the words and I do kind of get into the writing, I think. And so I'm not making conscious decisions about where my feet are or something, but I think that might be part of why that I'm sort of leaning in to the text itself in some way. But I wonder how common that pattern is across my readings. I'll have to be thinking about it in the future.
How did you get to write those pieces?
Yeah, well, I mean, each piece in here has its own story of kind of how I came to it. But I think with the piece I just read, it was really an attempt to narrate the particular time in my life when I came to this book that had a really deep effect on me. I mean, Let Us Not Praise Famous Men is, I don't know how many people in the room know it or have read it, but it's a pretty incredible but very controversial work of documentary recounting, I guess you could say, because James Agee went someplace as a journalist, but he really ended up writing a much more deeply personal account of what it felt like to him. I mean, because kind of gets back to Ethan's introduction, like he also felt no shame about saying this is what something felt like for me. So you get a lot of material about these families that he was observing, but you also get a lot about his internal process. So I think for some people that feels deeply honest and revelatory. It certainly felt that way to me, and to other people it feels completely solipsistic and self-absorbed, and like Agee is pushing his own subjects out of the frame, and that tension itself is really interesting to me too. But I think with that piece I wanted to say I didn't read this book in a vacuum. Like when I was reading this book, there was this stuff going on in my life that was very much a part of what I was experiencing when I entered into his pages, and so I wanted to document that intersection. And I think for almost every book I've read, for almost any book anybody's read, there's some kind of really, I think, powerful intersection there between whatever they're living and what they're reading. And that was kind of a case study in looking at that kind of encounter.
Yeah. So, do you have a question?
Oh, if you have a follow-up.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Too. This is I know there are a lot of students in the room who are sort of trying to figure out how to locate their own voices, and they're trying to sort of figure out if maybe they're poets or could be writing nonfiction or fiction writers. And I know that you've written a novel and these sort of wonderful essays. And I don't know if you write poetry, but you write beautifully about poetry. And so I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about sort of how you think about sort of the shape that your work is going to take. Right? How do you know when you have sort of an idea that perhaps would work for fiction versus nonfiction?
Yeah.
Or something like that, because I think it's a question that's on.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, sometimes I don't even know what something is going to be like. I haven't written poetry in a long time. I did spend about a year in college, actually, only writing poetry. And I had this experience. I went to Seattle for the first time about a year ago and wanted to write a poem for the first time in a long time. And I don't know where that came from. I think I just felt overwhelmed by, I was having some sort of very intense experience in the city, and I was like, I need to write a poem. But then it really was like an essay. I mean, it was a poem that didn't have any line breaks, that it was really long, so I was like, oh, maybe I've actually just written an essay again. I mean, which is a way to say, I think you kind of, for me at least, sometimes I just write, and I'm not sure what form it's going to be. The novel that I wrote, I've written a few, but the one that made it into the world started just as notes I was taking about what my daily life was like at that moment. I was living with my grandmother and taking care of her as she was quite ill, and I was just writing down what was happening, and I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to write a novel from this or about it. But that material, I ended up feeling like, oh, I don't want to write this as just a document of my experience. I kind of want to follow this material into a what if. Like, what if this had happened a little bit differently, or what if this had gone there next? And so it was really just following that impulse that took it into the realm of fiction. And I think with these essays, I didn't go into it with a sense of kind of, I want to become an essay writer. I just went into it with a sense of part of what felt exciting and compelling to me was journeying out into the world to ask people questions and think about the responses they gave me. And it was sort of the hunger for that more outward process that started to dictate the form of writing essays. Not to say that process can also be part of what it means to research and write fiction, but it ended up taking me here. But I also think there's no reason that any of us have to choose, you know? It's
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I love the pairing of the objects, West Memphis 3 and AG. It's really surprising and wonderful the way you put them together. And I was wondering if you could speak about the ways in which belief informs both of those. You know, the iconography of heavy metal and satanic rituals are all in the West Memphis 3 case. And AG's own Catholicism so deeply informed that book. And so how does it mix with you when you think about empathy as a process in a secular age?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think part of what feels true to me about belief as a connective thread between those pieces is the way that AG's always like reckoning with beliefs more than espousing them or sort of operating from a position of certainty, at least it seems to me, within them. And so certain both like political discourses like communism or his kind of vexed relationship with that, and even like this idea of like kind of journalism as a belief system that you buy into or don't or kind of do. It seems like part of the power of that book comes from feeling him like bucking up against the prescriptions of certain belief systems, but also being driven by like some sort of deep imperative towards like encounter and documenting other lives. And you know, it's interesting because in the West Memphis 3, it always struck me that belief was being wielded from the outside as some kind of weapon, right? That you know, for Jason and Damien, and to a lesser extent Jesse, like certain kinds of beliefs were really more than anything just a way to create a distance between themselves and the world that they were living inside of, to say we feel like outsiders and we articulate that sense of outsiderhood through wearing black or the music we listen to, and it's an outsiderhood that is also connecting us to some other system, like other guys out there who are 15 years old and wearing black and listening to heavy metal. And I think it's kind of that, for me, part of what was so powerful was just like seeing in them that simultaneous sense of being outside of the world that they lived in, but that hunger for some kind of connection, and they either had it in a more abstract way through the music, but at the end of the day, it seemed like they really had it in relation to each other. You know, that they did remain very meaningful figures for each other. And like, at one point, Damien wrote a memoir about his time in prison. He's written a couple now, but in the one that he wrote while he was still there, he describes this one moment where he saw Jason like across. They were housed in the same facility, and he kind of like spotted him through some sort of wall or division, and that moment meant so much to him because he'd been inside since the time when they had been best friends, so he didn't have other connections that could sort of rival that. But I was so struck and kind of moved by, it almost seemed like more than they believed in like Wicca or I mean, they certainly weren't satanic. That was just something that was said about them, that they kind of believed in the bonds that those external things had allowed them to form with each other. So, yeah. Yeah.
Talk about your choice to use the first person or the third person. I think in the first essay, I'm hearing it as the third person until that moment you start talking about fairy tales. I think that's when the eye first appears.
Yeah.
I should be thinking about Robin Hood, but I'm thinking about it was very striking because it's one kind of essay up until that moment, and then suddenly there's the eye.
Yeah.
Can you talk about why you choose to use one particular voice or another, and just understand the technique?
Yeah. That's a really fascinating observation about that piece, because I think you're right. That's the first time that the eye comes in, and I mean, the eye is already there in the sense that the eye is the one noticing sort of these details, or the eye is the one comparing the music getting loud to a kid kind of cranking up the volume or whatever. But it is, I think, a different effect to confess the eye explicitly and to say, sort of, this is how my subjectivity is informing what I'm showing you. And I think it's no accident that it kind of happens at the moment where the eye is making a mistake or getting something wrong or getting something confused, because that's a kind of natural point of rupture where the kind of smooth surface of just being a neutral observer or documenter, or at least holding up that facade, kind of has to break down. And you say, or I said there, like, you know, there were these ways that when I was seeing this story, I kept trying to shape the narrative into something that would make sense, or I kept trying to apply this fairy tale even though the proper noun belonged to that fairy tale. And that it's kind of in those moments where we start actively deforming or misinterpreting things that the force of our own interpretive influence, I think, becomes kind of undeniable. It starts to exert itself. But there are other pieces there too where The Broken Heart of James Agee is a part of these series of shorter essays called Pain Tours, and they're all about voyeurism of different forms. And some of those essays actually happen in the second person, which is a whole other kind of perspective to inhabit, but where I'm less I think I'm less talking to readers or saying you feel this or you say this, and more addressing myself as kind of a writer, looking back at myself as a traveler having a certain kind of experience. But it's like a third one to throw in the mix. So yeah.
You talking about AG makes me wonder about the way you view your own reporting, because in traditional journalism, a lot of the way you use it in the writing is to show your work, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not how you use reporting in most of your essays. And so I'm curious how you work that in when it's so much about, it's not trying to prove anything. It's not saying I was here, distinguishing between primary and secondary sources, etc.
Yeah. Can you say a bit more about sort of reporting as a way of showing your work versus not?
Well, for example, you don't seem to use a lot of quotes
Right.
in a lot of your essays, even when you have spoken to people individually. And so it actually can be hard to tell, is this from a primary source, is this from a secondary source, etc. Whereas in, I'm a magazine editor, so it's a lot about like proving essentially
Right.
that you talk to these people.
Right.
And so I'm just curious, like, how you navigate that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think part of what happened in putting some of these essays together in one volume is that there was a kind of continuum set up between experiences of encounter that were essentially kind of functioning as memoir, right? Where it was saying, I went here and did these things and had these encounters with people. And I think those end up playing out quite differently and probably being more kind of confined within my sense and my experience and my impressions, versus the pieces that were sort of conducted from the outset as explicitly journalistic endeavors. And there's a piece, it sounds like you've read them all, but there's a piece in here about a condition called Morgellons disease. That's this controversial skin condition where people report having kind of unexplainable fibers coming out of their bodies. There's a piece about the ultramarathon I mentioned in Tennessee. There's a piece about visiting one of those ultra runners in prison. And for those pieces, partially because they were happening towards also magazine writing, like the process was very different there. Like everything is recorded and fact checked, and they do have quite a few more quotes and things like that. So the process of kind of both representing the voices of others and doing that in a more structured way was happening kind of under different auspices. And I think part of that is also kind of the arc of my evolution as a writer, where I started as a fiction writer very far away from kind of the nuts and bolts of journalistic practice, and learned those nuts and bolts insofar as I know them, not through going to journalism school or anything like that, but through kind of individual relationships with editors who were like, this is how you have to do it. This is what our fact checker needs. Probably the conversations you have all the time. So I think for me, there was a real learning curve that is one of the stories underneath this book is sort of my own learning certain ropes of how I wanted to be engaging the world.
How did you do that?
How did I learn those
Yes.
things? Yeah, really through relationships with editors. So getting certain pieces that I knew I was writing for certain magazines, and the editors and I are going back and forth about the process, and I'm sort of picking up. I mean, some of it is just trial and error, sort of figuring out in the process of relating to subjects, like what kinds of encounters, what things help people open up, what kinds of things, say like recording interviews, right? Like I think it's really easy to believe in the abstract that memory deforms things and shapes things, but I know at least for me, I still always had this belief that like I had a really good memory and I could kind of remember things right. But it's like the second I started recording my interviews, I was fully aware of how 2 hours after a conversation, I was already narrating to myself what somebody had said or what their voice was like in a particular moment, and then I listen to the recording and I see the ways in which it's different, and that to me didn't destabilize my sense of myself so much as it was like this testimony to like how the mind is constantly, it felt fertile rather than frightening, I guess, but it did make me understand more why recording interviews isn't just like a hoop I jump through for a magazine. It's a process that I have come to really believe in. So some of it is just like you do the thing and then you realize where it goes wrong, and so then you do it a different way the next time, that kind of basic learning curve too. But
Good time maybe for one more question. All right, now I'll ask you. Can you just talk maybe sort of quickly about maybe how you sort of approach drafting a piece versus how you approach the revision process?
yeah.
Just sort of going off the question about sort of craft issues. And there's a lot of frowny faces in the audience because they're in the middle of revisions right now.
Yeah, I mean, often for me, like, I think I can be an editor's worst nightmare because I always draft really long. Like, that's just like the one true thing about my process. So especially when it's a reported piece, then I kind of find a lot of stuff that I find interesting and then I want to just put it all in. I don't want to make any choices. But I even think when a piece isn't reported and it's more internal, I am aware that I do a thing where I kind of say something 20 times and it's pretty much the same thing, but part of me is struggling towards like, what's the best way to say this thing, or what do I really mean when I'm saying this thing? And so drafting for me is just like letting myself put everything out there, and then revision is sort of, it's almost like running a metal detector over the sand or something, and then I see the moments where the piece that I've written like really feels like it has energy or heat or has come into focus, and then I kind of orient myself around those moments and say these are the moments where the essay really seems to be finding its stride, and now how can I sort of follow those moments towards structuring the ultimate version of a piece. So yeah.
That's not great. Well, thank you very much for
Yeah, thanks for having me.